The first time my son, a paramedic, told someone I was a danger to myself, he wasn't holding a medical kit. He was holding a pen, poised over a document that would sign away my life. His wife Sophia stood beside him, her smile as sharp and sterile as a scalpel, nodding in agreement. They weren't trying to save me. They were performing a quiet, bloodless excision of my name from the deed of the home I'd built with my own 2 hands. He handcuffed me to a chair with his words, right there on my own front lawn, as the neighbors watched, their faces frozen in a confused tableau of pity and suspicion. Sophia, his polished, perfect wife, didn't lay a hand on me, but her accusation slapped me harder than any physical blow could. "She's lost her mind," she announced to the quiet street, her voice ringing with a manufactured concern that made my stomach turn. They said I was unstable, that I needed help, that my memory was failing.
The neighbors, people I'd shared coffee and condolences with for over 2 decades, stood paralyzed, caught between the shocking sight and the calm, authoritative explanation. But I knew the truth. I had paid for that house in Port Blossom, Maine, brick by brick, year by year. It was paid for with double shifts as a court paralegal, with decades of meticulously managed budgets, with the ghost of my late husband's life insurance. And that night, with a cold coastal wind soaking through my sweater and the steel of their judgment biting into my spirit, I realized there was something far worse than betrayal. It was the silence that followed it. They thought I was powerless, a relic to be managed, but they didn't know who I was before I became their mother. I helped draft the very legal frameworks they were now trying to twist against me. I had started avoiding the upstairs altogether. The grand staircase I once polished with pride now felt like a mountain I was forbidden to climb. Man, I knew exactly which floorboards creaked outside the master bedroom. I knew how long the kettle whistled before Sophia would sigh dramatically and say I was doing it on purpose to disrupt her morning meditation. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the woman who once called me Mom now wished I would simply vanish. The house, my house, felt like it belonged to someone else. It was the same house I bought 32 years ago, with the settlement from my husband's accident, a place I filled with light and laughter and the smell of baking bread. My name wasn't on the new title, not anymore. I had asked my son Michael to add his name 5 years back when a cancer scare made me fear the probate courts. It was meant to be a temporary safeguard, a bridge over troubled water. He never added mine back. The irony was a bitter pill I choked on daily. I still paid the property taxes from my pension. I still covered most of the repairs from my savings. I even gave them the money for the new boiler last winter, but Sophia didn't want me near the fuse box when the electrician came, said I made people nervous with my hovering. Most nights I stayed in my small downstairs room, a converted study that felt more like a cell. I had a mini fridge, a hot plate, and the worn recliner my husband used to love. Michael used to bring my dinner plate down himself, his gaze always fixed somewhere over my shoulder. These days they just left it on the floor outside my door, like a meal for a stray animal. They had started calling it their home out loud in front of me. "In our home," Sophia would say, "we do things a certain way." That stung more than I ever expected. One afternoon, she strode into my room without knocking, a tablet in her hand. She said they needed the space for her new wealth management office and that it made more sense if I stayed in the chilly sunroom, or better yet, looked into one of those senior facilities that had a lovely community. Michael stood behind her in the doorway, silent, his arms crossed over the faded logo of the Port Blossom Fire Department on his t-shirt. He wouldn't meet my eyes. His silence hurt worse than anything she could ever say. I asked if I had done something wrong, my voice barely a whisper. Sophia didn't even dignify it with a response. She just smiled that placid, dismissive smile and said, "It's not personal, Eleanor. It's just time." But it was deeply personal. It was the deliberate dismantling of my life, piece by piece. That night, as I sat alone listening to their laughter drift down from the kitchen, I pulled out an old photo of Michael getting his paramedic certification. He was beaming, his arms slung around me on the steps of the academy. I had been so proud, so blindingly naive. I kept replaying the years in my head, searching for the exact moment my son stopped seeing me as his mother and started seeing me as a line item on a balance sheet, a liability. They didn't scream. They didn't slam doors. That would have been easier to fight. Instead, they chipped away at my presence with quiet, relentless efficiency, like a soft, consistent eraser on a page. And still, a foolish, maternal part of me wanted to believe Michael didn't mean it, that he was caught in the middle, too weak to stand up to his formidable wife. But something in his eyes that day, empty, resolved, a shutter pulled down, told me he had chosen his side long ago. If you've ever sat in a house you built, surrounded by the family you raised, and still felt profoundly invisible, then you understand. You understand what it means to lose your place in your own world, and worse, to realize your absence wouldn't even be noticed. It started with a quiet breakfast and a stack of papers on the polished kitchen table. Sophia sat there already, dressed in a sharp blazer, her hair in a severe knot, tapping a fountain pen against the granite countertop. Her artisanal coffee was barely touched. When I walked in, she didn't look up. Michael stood by the new stainless steel fridge, arms folded. He didn't say good morning. He just gestured to the chair across from her as if I were a client, not his mother. I sat down. My coffee was already poured, lukewarm. I noticed that with a strange detachment, as if they had rehearsed this moment. Sophia slid a sleek leather folder across the table. Inside were a set of documents, neatly arranged with bright yellow tabs marking where I was supposed to sign. She didn't offer a long explanation, just said this would make things simpler, more secure. If anything happened to me, she explained, she and Michael wouldn't have to go through a bunch of legal mess to handle the estate. She used the word streamlining 3 times. I kept my hands folded in my lap, the knuckles white. I asked who had drafted the documents. A friend of mine, she said dismissively. Top of his field. Estate law. She used that tone again. Professional, efficient, a thin veneer over a core of absolute control. Then Michael spoke, his voice low and practiced. He said it was just a formality, that we were still a family, that they loved me. The words felt hollow, disconnected from his rigid posture. I looked at the first page. It was a quitclaim deed. I was to transfer full ownership of the house to Michael and Sophia Vance as a joint gift with immediate effect. No clauses, no protections, no life estate granting me the right to remain. It was a complete and total surrender. What if I don't sign? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Sophia's professional smile flickered. Of course, you can stay here as long as you want, Eleanor, she said, the words a gentle lie. But things are getting more complicated with taxes, insurance, liability. That word again. Liability. I had been downgraded from a person to a risk. Michael didn't say another word. He just stared at the wall behind me. I told them I needed time. Sophia's smile froze for a beat, then softened into a mask of understanding. Of course, she purred. Take a day or 2. But things are in motion, and we'd all feel better with this settled. I carried the folder to my room. It felt like it weighed 50 pounds. I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at it, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. I wasn't surprised. I had seen the storm gathering on the horizon for months. I just didn't know it would feel like this, like being quietly executed with a pen instead of a blade. The rest of that day was shrouded in a thick, suffocating silence. No one brought me dinner. I didn't eat. The papers stayed on my nightstand, a monument to my own erasure. The next morning, Michael knocked softly on my door. That was unusual. He used to just walk in. He asked if I'd had a chance to read everything. I said yes. He asked if I was ready to sign. I said no. His face didn't change. He just nodded and said, "Well, let me know when you are." By that evening, the hallway light outside my room had been unscrewed. I heard the groan of the attic ladder being pulled down, the shuffle of boxes being moved. Sophia's voice, muffled but firm, was directing him, rearranging, reclaiming space, as if I were already a ghost. That night, I didn't sleep. The old house creaked around me, its groans sounding like labored breaths. I kept thinking how bizarre it was to be surrounded by your own furniture, your own curtains, your own framed photographs, and still feel like an intruder. My presence was tolerated, not welcomed. No one slammed doors, no one raised their voice, but the message was crystal clear. They wanted me out. Not next year, not next month, soon. 3 days after they gave me the documents, I walked into the living room and found them standing by the mantelpiece, whispering. Sophia held a measuring tape. Michael held his phone, scrolling through images. They stopped talking the moment they saw me. She smiled too quickly. "We were just thinking about redoing the walls," she said brightly. "Maybe a new coat of paint, updating the space a little." She gestured toward the far end of the room where my reading nook was. "I was thinking this would make a fantastic studio space for my portfolio work. The natural light is just incredible." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. I walked past them and stood in front of the fireplace. There, on the shelf where I had always kept the silver-framed photo of my late husband and me on our wedding day, I found the frame had been turned face down. Right beside it was a glossy new photo of Sophia and Michael, arms around each other in front of a sold sign. The photo had the logo of her wealth management firm in the corner. That same night, I opened the linen closet in the hallway to get a fresh towel, and my breath caught in my chest. Half my things were gone. The top shelf where I stored my old photo albums and winter sweaters was completely bare. In their place were plastic storage bins I didn't recognize, labeled with Sophia's neat, sharp handwriting. Marketing supplies, client files, office inventory. I didn't say anything, not yet. The next morning, Sophia informed me she had booked an appointment for me at a local senior housing community. She called it a tour. She said she had already spoken to the director, and they had a room available by the end of the month. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a directive. Her tone had shifted from veiled persuasion to undisguised command. I asked why she thought that was necessary. She replied that she was just thinking of everyone's comfort and safety. The house had shifted, she said. Her work required privacy. The neighborhood, she added, wasn't really suitable for someone my age to be living in, implying I was alone. "I'm not alone," I reminded her, my voice low. "This is my house." She corrected me without blinking. "It used to be," she said softly. Michael stepped in then, hands on his hips, assuming the stance of a man in charge. "Mom, this isn't about ownership anymore," he said, his voice flat. "It's about what makes sense. We have plans. The house needs to evolve." I was part of the past. He didn't use those words exactly, but that's what he meant. I was a shadow of what used to matter. I felt my knees go weak, but I stood my ground. Later that day, I walked down the hallway toward the back room where I kept my old files in a locked cabinet, records from my 30 years as a paralegal at a small family law practice, manuals, case notes, deposition transcripts. The cabinet was open. The lock had been forced. The folders were gone. I frantically searched the closet, the bottom drawers, even the shoebox where I kept copies of my own legal papers. Empty. That evening, they served dinner without a word. Roast chicken, asparagus, quinoa. My portion was on a paper plate, placed on a small side table with plastic utensils. I looked across the room and saw they were eating from my wedding china, drinking wine from my crystal glasses. It was a subtle, deliberate act of demotion. I was no longer family. I was an occupant. I knew by then that they weren't waiting for me to sign anymore. They were preparing for the day I'd be gone, whether I consented or not, and what broke my heart the most was the quiet confidence in their actions, as if they truly believed they could erase a person without ever lifting their voices. Just small, methodical steps, redefining the space, the routine, the story, rewriting the narrative of this house without me in it. It was a Sunday afternoon when things finally tipped. Sophia asked me to come upstairs. Her voice was even, too calm, like she'd rehearsed every word. When I reached the top of the stairs, I noticed my family portraits were gone from the hallway wall. In their place were large, impersonal canvas prints of seascapes and inspirational quotes about financial freedom. I paused, my hand on the banister. She noticed. She led me into what used to be my sewing room. The door had been freshly painted a sterile white. Inside, my antique sewing cabinet was gone. The cozy armchair had been replaced with a sleek glass desk, a ring light, a laptop, and a branded backdrop bearing the logo of Sophia's firm. She called it her new office. "Where are my things?" I asked, the words feeling foreign in my own home. "They've been moved into the sunroom for now," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "Just until you've finalized your next steps." Her words were polite, but they were final. Michael stood in the doorway, a silent, imposing sentinel. That same night, I heard movement again, the scraping of boxes on the hardwood floor. I stepped out of my room quietly and walked toward the garage. The lights were on. Michael was stacking my storage bins, now relabeled with tape in Sophia's handwriting. Some were marked "Donate." Others were labeled "Attic." Some had no label at all. He didn't stop when he saw me, just kept taping a box shut. His silence was a wall between us. "Is this really happening?" I whispered. He finally looked at me, his eyes empty of emotion. "It's just best to get ahead of things, Mom," he said. "No drama." He used that phrase, "no drama," as if he were the one being inconvenienced. I went back to my room, closed the door, and sat in the dark for a long time. They were trying to make it look clean, like a business transition, but it felt like a quiet assassination of a life. No papers, no arguments, just erasure. The next morning, they called a family meeting. They didn't ask if I was available. They told me to be in the dining room at 10. I sat at the head of the table, the same spot where I used to serve holiday meals, where Michael once sat swinging his short legs as a boy. Now he was a man in his 40s, his arms crossed, his face a closed book. Sophia placed a thick manila envelope in front of me. Inside were 2 sets of documents. One was the quitclaim deed again, this time with a sticky note pointing to the signature line. The other was a glossy brochure for the senior living facility, folded neatly to a page showing a small, sterile room. A handwritten note on top read, "Pre-approved, move-in ready." She said it was a safety precaution. Then she dropped the bomb. "I've spoken to someone about elder vulnerability laws," she said softly, carefully. "Technically, we could petition the court for conservatorship if you're seen as unable to make sound decisions for yourself." It landed like a ton of bricks. I looked at Michael. He didn't flinch. I stood up. My knees were shaking, but I wouldn't let them see it. I walked out of the room and into the kitchen. My breath felt tight in my chest. I opened the back door and stepped into the crisp autumn air. They weren't just asking me to leave. They were preparing to make sure I could never come back. And that's when it shifted. Not in a loud way, not with a crash of broken glass, but as a quiet, definitive click deep inside me. I walked back to my room, opened the bottom drawer of my cedar chest, and reached for something I hadn't touched in years. It was a worn, leather-bound journal, one of a dozen I had kept during my career. Tucked inside the back cover was a single business card. I slid the card into my pocket. I didn't have a concrete plan yet, but I had something they didn't know about. A lifetime of legal knowledge and a memory that was far from failing. And for now, that was enough. The business card hadn't seen daylight in over a decade. It belonged to an old colleague, Sarah Jenkins, who had left private practice to start a nonprofit legal aid clinic for seniors. We called it the Justice Project. I had helped her write the charter. I didn't call her yet. I just kept the card close. The next few days passed in a haze of quiet calculation. I watched them, but differently now. Not as a mother, but as a paralegal gathering evidence. I started noticing things I hadn't before. Subtle phone calls between Sophia and someone she only referred to as her legal consultant. A folder left open on the kitchen counter labeled Conservatorship Checklist. A browser tab left on her laptop showing a page on how to document cognitive decline in a relative. It was never just about the house. They were building a legal cage around me to remove my autonomy completely. They had already planted a narrative that I wasn't mentally sound, that I needed managed care, that I was a danger to myself. I found an envelope addressed to a prominent local estate lawyer. The return address was Sophia's office. I didn't confront them. Not yet. Instead, I went into the garage one afternoon when they were out and pulled down the locked chest I'd stored on the upper shelf, the one they hadn't found. Inside were my journals. 30 years of them. I hadn't touched them since I retired, but I knew my system. I had co-written half the training manuals on family law documentation for our firm. I knew the process, I knew the loopholes, I knew how to build a case. I started gathering everything, every interaction, every conversation. I transcribed their threats, their dismissals, their manipulations, with dates and times. I printed screenshots of old text exchanges with Michael from 5 years ago, where I explicitly stated that adding him to the deed was a temporary measure for medical power of attorney, not a transfer of ownership. I took photos of my medication bottles, all perfectly organized. I even found the old baby monitor I'd used when Michael's daughter was little and tucked it behind a stack of books in my room. It captured clear audio of Sophia on the phone, telling her consultant how to frame the narrative of my instability to the court. I documented everything. One night, I heard them in the kitchen. Sophia was laughing. She told Michael not to worry. "By the time she realizes what's happened," she said, her voice dripping with confidence, "the paperwork will already be filed. These cases don't need much proof if the story is emotional enough and the subject is of a certain age." I wrote that down word for word, my hand steady. It was then I decided to make the call. Not a dramatic gesture, just a quiet conversation. I dialed the number for the Justice Project. Sarah answered on the second ring. The next morning, things moved with a quiet swiftness they hadn't anticipated. Michael came down, dressed not in his uniform, but in casual clothes. He said we had a visitor arriving. "Someone from Adult Protective Services," he said, trying to sound nonchalant. "A wellness check, routine paperwork." I just nodded. 10 minutes later, a modest sedan pulled up, not an official vehicle. A woman in her late 40s stepped out, carrying a simple leather briefcase. Her name was Sarah Jenkins. Michael opened the door, a flicker of confusion on his face. He was expecting an overworked social worker he could easily manage. He wasn't expecting this sharp, composed woman who asked for him by his full name, not as a son, but as a subject of inquiry. Sophia appeared in the doorway wearing a blazer, dressed for a negotiation. But when Sarah introduced herself as my legal counsel and requested to see the documents they had drafted, along with Sophia's own financial advisory license and her client intake forms from the past month, Sophia's carefully constructed composure shattered. I stepped back and let them take the room. There was no yelling, no struggle, just the sound of pens clicking open and the quiet, authoritative rustle of papers being reviewed. Michael didn't look at me, not once, and I didn't need to say a word. I woke up the next morning to the quietest house I'd heard in months. No tense footsteps overhead, no whirring blender, no hushed, urgent conversations. Just the soft hum of the refrigerator and the gentle tapping of a finch at the window. Sarah had stayed for nearly 3 hours the day before. She moved with a polite but unyielding firmness. She focused on the conservatorship papers Sophia had drafted, pointing out the legal inconsistencies and the lack of medical documentation. She reviewed my journals, my photos, the audio from the baby monitor. I hadn't known how deep it all went. It turned out Sophia had accessed my private financial records through a back channel at her firm, compiling a file that suggested I was mismanaging my funds. She had built an entire story on carefully selected half-truths, just enough to frame me as a liability, just enough to justify a quick signature from an overburdened judge. But now that story was under a different kind of review. By noon, I received a call from Sarah. She spoke slowly, clearly. She told me she had filed a formal complaint with the State Financial Regulatory Board against Sophia for unethical practices and breach of fiduciary duty. She had also filed a motion to void the quitclaim deed on the grounds of elder abuse and undue influence. A full audit of their finances was now underway. None of that changed the fact that I was still living in the same house with the same person. Michael came home late that night, alone. His steps were heavy on the stairs. He walked past my room without stopping. I heard the fridge open and close, then silence. Sophia never came back. The next day, a notice arrived by courier, a formal request for a meeting with the Office of Property Claims, listing me as the current disputed occupant and Michael and Sophia as the temporary transferees. That phrasing gave me a jolt of hope. I called the number at the bottom of the page. The clerk on the other end of the line recognized my name from Sarah's filing. She said there had been a flag on the title transfer request from the beginning, something about inconsistencies with the signatures, mismatched dates. She said they would be freezing any changes until a full review was completed. I hung up the phone and sat with that for a long time. The house was still mine, not just emotionally, but legally. I had survived it. I had named every wall, every brick, every repaired hinge in this house with my own labor and love. And I realized something I hadn't felt in weeks: relief. Not joy, not victory, just quiet, steady relief. But it was followed by a wave of grief, not for the betrayal that had already done its damage. It was grief for the boy my son used to be. The boy who once hid behind me during thunderstorms had learned to stand tall by trying to erase me. He didn't just let Sophia do it. He helped her. He chose her plan. He watched me shrink in my own home and never once reached out a hand. I no longer hoped he'd apologize. I no longer wished he'd explain. I simply knew, with a devastating clarity, that I would never trust him again. That was the final loss. And in the silence of my room, I finally accepted it. The days that followed moved in slow, quiet waves. Michael barely spoke. He stayed upstairs most of the time, his door shut, his phone pressed to his ear. I could hear fragments of conversations through the floorboards. Union rep, administrative leave, internal review. Each word confirmed what I already knew. He wasn't on vacation, as he'd told the neighbors. He wasn't allowed to wear his uniform. Sophia didn't come back. She sent a courier to collect her things. 2 large boxes taped shut. One of them had my handwriting on the side. It had once held Christmas lights. I didn't stop them. I just opened the front door and let the man take them away. I spent the next afternoon in the sunroom. The air was cool and steady. For the first time in months, I opened the window, letting the breeze stir the curtains, a reminder that the house could still breathe. Then I went to the back closet and pulled out the last file I had hidden. It was the original property folder, signed and notarized 32 years ago. The deed had my name on it, and my name alone. The amendment from 5 years ago, which had added Michael temporarily, was stapled inside. It included a stipulation I had insisted on, one that my younger self, the sharp-eyed paralegal, had refused to omit. It stated that the joint tenancy would revert back to sole ownership upon resolution of my medical condition. That clause had never been triggered because I had recovered within 6 months, but I never filed the paperwork to change it back. I had trusted him to do it. That was my mistake. I took the folder to Sarah. She read it slowly, page by page, a small, grim smile playing on her lips. She said it was an open and shut case. The attempted transfer was voidable and likely fraudulent. We filed an injunction. Within a week, I received formal confirmation. The county had issued a permanent freeze on all title changes to the property. Michael would be served papers if he attempted any further transactions. When I came home that day, the hallway was dark. The television was silent. Michael sat at the kitchen table, his shoulders slumped, his eyes unfocused. He didn't ask where I had been. He didn't offer an apology. Instead, he just said, "I'll be moving out by the end of the month." No anger, no fight, just a flat statement of fact. I nodded. That night, I made soup for myself, the thick potato chowder I used to make when the boys were small. I didn't offer him any. I sat at the table with one bowl, one spoon, and one napkin. There was no place set for him. And for the first time in a long, long while, the silence didn't ache. It settled around me like a warm blanket, familiar, steady, mine. The house was still standing, and so was I. It was late September when Michael packed the last of his things. He didn't make an announcement. One day, I heard the sound of cardboard dragging across the floor. The next, his room was bare. No footsteps upstairs, no keys jangling by the door, just a profound stillness. I didn't watch him leave. I let him close that door without a goodbye. The driveway was empty by morning. What remained was a house that felt too quiet in all the wrong places. Not peaceful, not yet. Just emptied, like a theater after the curtain falls. The air is still thick with the drama that just played out. I didn't try to fill it. I let the quiet stay. That week, I went through every drawer, every closet, every corner of the house. I wasn't looking for things to save. I was looking for what needed to be removed. I found old emails Sophia had printed and tucked away, proposals for turning my garage into a rental unit, budget spreadsheets titled Renovation, Phase 1. None of them included my name. I fed every single sheet through the shredder. There were also things that didn't deserve to be erased. A photo of Michael when he was 10, smiling crookedly with a missing front tooth. A birthday card from years ago, where he had scribbled the word hero in blue marker. I didn't throw them away, but I didn't keep them on display either. I placed them in a sealed envelope and put it in the back of a cabinet. Some memories didn't need to be burned. They just needed to rest. After the house was cleared, I stood in the middle of the living room and asked myself what this space should become now that it was mine again. Not a showroom, not a shared battleground. Something softer, something real. I called a contractor and asked about taking down the partition wall Sophia had installed near the kitchen. He said it could be done in 2 days. I scheduled it. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I drove to the Justice Project's downtown office. The community center had been renovated with new benches and a small garden out back. I offered to run a workshop, not a lecture, just a weekly circle for women over 60. A space to talk about the things no one talks about. Dignity, space, power. Sarah smiled and said yes. We set the start date for October. On the way home, I stopped by a bookstore and bought a notebook. Not for legal notes, not for evidence. Just blank pages. I wanted a space to write without bracing myself. That night, I cooked for myself again. Same soup, a little thicker this time. I sat by the window, the cool wind on my face, and lit a candle. Not for mourning, but as a reminder that this house still had light. I no longer waited for footsteps down the hall. I no longer feared what might be taken. There was no victory banner hanging from the porch, no announcement made to the neighborhood. But in that silence, something had shifted. This house was mine, and this time I would protect it differently, not with anger, but with boundaries, with clarity, with the quiet power of someone who had been erased and decided to reappear on her own terms. The letter from the State Regulatory Board arrived on a Thursday morning. A plain, white envelope, no drama. Sophia's case had been formally reviewed. The findings concluded that her actions constituted a severe ethical breach. Her license was suspended indefinitely. When I spoke to Sarah, she told me several other clients had come forward with similar stories of manipulation. My case had simply been the one that broke the dam. That night, I sat in my new office, the sunroom, freshly repainted a warm ivory. I opened my new notebook to the first page and wrote down 3 names: Michael, Sophia, and Eleanor. I needed to see them side by side without distortion, to remind myself that this was not just about betrayal. It was about recognition, about seeing people clearly and choosing what roles they are allowed to keep in your life. The next morning, I called the county clerk's office. I asked to speak with the registrar regarding the property title. I gave them the deed number and requested that the title be legally amended, stripped of all temporary parties, and returned to my sole ownership. The clerk paused. Then she said the title had already been updated 2 days ago. It had been filed by an assistant working with the state's Elder Justice Committee as part of their investigation. It was already mine again, officially. I asked for a hard copy. She said one would be mailed within a week. As I ended the call, I looked around the room and felt the weight shift. Not lifted, just relocated to a place I could carry it without breaking. Later that day, a landscaping crew arrived. I had scheduled them weeks ago, asking for a full reset. They tore out the old, overgrown hedges Sophia had hated, pulled the roots, and cleared the soil. Then they planted dogwoods along the fence, soft lavender by the porch, and a small stone bench under the old oak tree Michael used to climb. I stood at the doorway and watched it unfold, like a memory being rewritten, not erased, just re-anchored. This wasn't about taking back power. It was about choosing peace over permission. And this time, no one was asking me to leave. It was early October when I received an invitation from the City Council's advisory board. They had heard about my case, not through headlines, but through a quiet recommendation from Sarah. They asked if I would consider joining a new task force on elder housing rights and protections. I didn't answer right away. But something inside me, a part of the old Eleanor, the one who fought for others, said yes before my mouth could catch up. The first meeting was in a modest brick building downtown. I walked in and recognized no one, but they listened when I spoke. They took notes when I told them how easily a family member could file a conservatorship claim without medical proof. They didn't look at me like a victim. They looked at me like an expert. After the meeting, I sat in my car and let the silence wash over me. Not the silence of loss, but the silence that comes after being truly heard. At home, I opened the windows and let the cool wind sweep through the hallways. I stood in the doorway of the room Michael once used. The light fell differently now, brighter, unfiltered. I didn't close the door. I left it open. Later that week, I ran my first women's circle. 7 of us sat with tea and notebooks. One woman spoke about her daughter moving her into a trailer behind her own house. Another talked about signing over her pension because her grandson promised he'd help manage it. No one interrupted. No one tried to fix it. We simply listened. When it was my turn, I didn't tell them everything. I just said, I used to believe that family was the safest place to rest. Now I believe it has to be the safest place to resist. That evening, I stood in my garden. The dogwoods had taken root quickly. I ran my hand across the stone bench and thought about all the versions of myself this house had held. A young wife, a mother, a widow, a woman begging to be seen. And now, A woman who had stopped begging, not bitter, not closed, just clear. I made soup again, thicker now, with barley and leeks, and ate at the table with one bowl, one chair. I didn't look at the clock or wait for footsteps. For the first time, the stillness felt like a presence, not an absence. It felt like something had returned. Not someone, but something. A sense of self that had been swallowed whole and now sat quietly beside me. I didn't need anyone to knock on the door. I had already come home. It was a cold morning when I walked past the mirror and saw myself clearly for the first time in a long while. Not the weariness, not the years. I saw the steadiness in my shoulders, the quiet resolve in my eyes, the refusal to bend any further. The house smelled like rosemary and books. The women's circle at the center had grown from 7 to 15. We came not just to speak, but to listen, to build. Michael never wrote. He never called. Some silences, I learned, deserve to remain untouched. One Sunday afternoon, I stood on the back steps with a cup of tea and watched a bird build a nest in the awning above the shed. Straw, thread, bits of something blue. Piece by piece, she carried her life in her beak and tucked it into the place she had chosen. Not the safest place, perhaps, but hers. And I thought, so had I. That week, I hosted the first gathering in my home. A few neighbors, women from the group, a pot of soup, and laughter that rose without permission. No one asked about the house or mentioned the past. I noticed how easily people moved through the space, like it was whole again, like I was whole. Later that night, I walked through each room, turning off the lights one by one. When I reached my bedroom, I paused by the open window and let the cool night air brush against my skin. Then I whispered something I hadn't said out loud in years, a truth that had finally taken root. I am not waiting anymore. Not for approval, not for repair, not for anyone to undo what was done. This life, however scarred, however quiet, is mine. And that, finally, is enough. If you have ever had to rebuild your life quietly, piece by piece, after someone tried to erase you, I hope this story reminded you of your own strength. Sometimes peace doesn't arrive with a fanfare. It shows up in the silence you finally get to choose for yourself. If any part of this resonated with you, please know you are not alone. Thank you for listening.